Heavy industry's net zero gap is structural, not motivational. When analysts track the gap between corporate net zero commitments and actual emissions trajectories, the sectors that stand out aren't the ones that said the least. In many cases, they're the ones that said the most. In agriculture, materials, transport, and heavy manufacturing, the industrial sectors where decarbonization is most complex, a significant share of commitments were made with genuine intent and without a credible path to delivery. The structural reality is this. For companies heavily dependent on emissions-intensive activities or value chains, ambition increasingly collides with systemic constraints that no amount of internal commitment can resolve alone. Low-carbon production alternatives may be unavailable, technically immature, or economically unviable under current market conditions. In the aforementioned industries, absolute emissions have not fallen at the pace implied by 1.5-degree aligned pathways, not because companies don't care, but because the systems in which they operate haven't changed fast enough. Accenture's research finding that only just over 10% of the 2,000 largest companies by revenue are on track for net zero by 2050 reflects this reality disproportionately in industrial sectors. And for operational leaders in those sectors, the question isn't whether to recommit to the original target. It's how to manage the gap between an on-record commitment and a structural constraint in a regulatory environment that is increasingly focused on accountability. What structural means in practice. In steel and cement manufacturing, meaningful Scope 1 decarbonization requires technology, green hydrogen, carbon capture, electric arc furnace deployment at scale, that is commercially available in pockets, but not at the production volumes that large manufacturers need. A commitment to net zero by 2050, made in 2021, assumed a technology deployment pace that procurement teams are now measuring against a very different reality. In freight and logistics, the electrification path for long-haul trucking and heavy equipment involves battery technology, charging infrastructure, and grid capacity that are improving but not on the schedule that 2030 interim targets implied. The commitment is real. The infrastructure isn't there yet. And in the interim, the gap between the commitment and the trajectory is what investors, regulators, and increasingly supply chain partners are focused on. In agriculture and food production, Scope 3 emissions from purchased agricultural commodities represent the largest share of a food company's footprint, and those emissions depend on farming practices that a company can influence through procurement standards but cannot directly control. The gap between a published deforestation-free sourcing commitment and the traceability infrastructure required to verify it in complex, multi-tier supply chains is wider than most companies' original timelines accounted for. How enforcement is reaching industrial sectors. Heavy industry has historically viewed greenwashing enforcement as a consumer-facing phenomenon, advertising and marketing claims that regulators scrutinize in retail contexts. That perception is changing. The EU's ECGT directive applies to business communications broadly. The UK's CMA guidance on supply chain liability explicitly addresses B2B environmental representations. And the CSRD's supply chain disclosure requirements are pulling industrial suppliers into the transparency infrastructure of their largest customers. Industrial companies that have published net zero commitments, used emissions-intensive supply chains, and haven't built the data systems to document their progress are now facing the same scrutiny that consumer brands have faced for longer. The enforcement mechanism is different. It's more likely to come through investor pressure, procurement qualification requirements, and CSRD-triggered disclosure obligations than through Consumer Protection Agency action. But the underlying accountability dynamic is the same: the path through the gap. The most credible position for industrial operations leaders isn't to distance themselves from existing commitments or to lower targets without explanation. It's to build the transparent, documented transition narrative that distinguishes genuine constraint from lack of effort. That means being specific about what structural barriers exist: technology immaturity, supply chain traceability gaps, infrastructure limitations, and asking the question, what is your company is doing about them? It means documenting near-term actions that are within operational control: energy efficiency gains, electrification of lower-intensity processes, supplier engagement programs, capital allocation toward available transition technologies. And it means maintaining a credible engagement posture with investors and regulators that doesn't rely on targets that the operational evidence doesn't support. The companies that will manage the structural gap most effectively are the ones that build honest, evidence-based narratives around their transition progress, not the ones that either overclaim or go quiet. In industrial sectors where the barriers are real, that narrative is both defensible and, for the right audience, persuasive. You've been listening to Sustainability Soundbites by Environment+Energy Leader. For partnership opportunities, please reach out to our team.